Welcome back to Daily Dose of Septuagint. Today we're having another special edition, and we are back in the desert sands west of the Dead Sea, taking a look at the Minor Prophet Scroll known as 8 Chev, 12 Greek, from the Cave of Horrors that was found alongside Nachal Hever there. In the prior video, I showed you some of the geography, gave you a bit of the history. If you recall, this scroll was found buried in the Cave of Horrors along with about 40 other skeletons of dead Jewish refugees that had fled to that cave during the Bar Kokhba revolt of the Second Jewish-Roman War, roughly around 135, but this particular scroll was found in the 1950s, published in the early 60s, and last time we looked at a bit of Zechariah. Today we're going to probe the question, does there appear to be, in the Greek tradition here, represented in this particular scroll, something that we could call a kaige or proto-Theodosian sort of Hebraizing tendency? In other words, if you know anything about Septuagint scholarship, and I'll cover some of this stuff in future videos, there was a movement that started at some point prior to the turn of the era where you kind of have the Greek tradition that we now know as the Septuagint, but then you have a revision of that back towards something that is a little bit closer to, at least at certain points, what we know as the Hebrew. And so this particular scroll became famous because it may or may not be evidence for that. So we're going to look at that today by doing some translation work. We're going to pick up in a scroll of Micah, and so you see that on the screen here, courtesy of the Leon Levy Digital Library for the Dead Sea Scrolls, which you can find online. I've linked to it elsewhere in the links for Daily Dose. And it's a beautiful fragment here. What we're going to do is just do sort of a straightforward transcription, translation kind of exercise like we normally do. And then what we'll do is compare this to what we see, for instance, in the Göttingen edition or Rolf's Honhart for this particular passage, and then sort of point out some differences and why it raises some of those interesting questions about whether there is some sort of translational tendency evident in the Minor Prophet Scroll. So that's the game plan. So let's dig into Micah here. And we are going to be in chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, which may ring a bell. That's a very famous Christmas-oriented passage, prophesying the birth of a ruler from Bethlehem. I actually covered this in the Christmas edition of 2025 in December with Patrick Schreiner. You can go back and take a look at that. We'll do a few more verses here, but we'll be looking at a manuscript. I do apologize out of the gate that it's going to be fairly small font on your screen. This is a fairly dense scroll, and hopefully you can still make it out. So let's begin with this first line. You can sort of make out a fairly enlarged in kappa and then a alpha and a iota here. So there are some kind of interesting paratextual type stuff and ecthesis in this case. Maybe an enlarged in kappa. It kind of looks like it to me at least, although you can see elsewhere on the screen that some of the kappas at the beginning of the line are a little bit big. So we start with a chi, and then there is, you can't really make it out, there's a su and then an oikos here. You can't see that sigma that would be right here. Something's filling in the blank, and then the end of Ephrathah. So most would just argue that, again, that you're trying to they're trying to piece this fragment as close as they can. You see they've kind of tied it together with strings and so forth. So whether there's more here is hard to say, but most editions just have oikos to Ephrathah. So, and you, house of Ephrathah. And then you have the Omicron, Lambda, Yoda. You're missing a gamma here, and then ostos, so alagostos, being few, something like that. Then the genitive article there, and then most likely the start of the infinitive of a me, which you don't see. It's out here floating in space. You can't see that, but we do see it kind of finish on the next line with the NAI. And so it's to ani, so fewest to be, that's what that's going to be, this articular infinitive with the ani there. That's why it's in the genitive, fewest to be. And then you can see the n here, your preposition, and then we're missing, you see actually the start of the chi there, and then we're missing some stuff. You have the end of Judah, so it's in the Chiliasin Judah, in the myriad or the thousands of Judah. Then when you nice and clearly have the ek, then a su here. You have the traces of a mu here, oi, so ek su moi, so from you to me. And then even though it's mostly cut off, we have the start, that's going to be xi there, of the verb exelucitai. And so, so not all of it is there. And as always, I'm sort of marking the missing bits here in blue. So we're going to continue on the next line, and you see the tie ending. Let's go ahead and throw that up on screen. And then we have yet again a 2 and an ani. You can barely make out the bottom of those letters. Something, something here is missing. You got it, maybe an alpha or something like that. And then you have the end of archanta. So, to be as a ruler, something like that. In, there's your preposition once more. To, your article. And then you have the start of Israel. And then you fill it in with Israel. Kai, hi, is mostly how folks reconstruct that missing bit. So, and the something. So anyways, in order to be ruler in Israel, and something plural. So next line we have exodoi, your exoduses, your goings out, if you will, and it's autu, so it's going to be his, referring back to this ruler. So this ruler, he has some exoduses, and then you have the op, arches. You can barely make out the he, eta, sigma there. So his going outs or departures are from the beginning. And then you have off, you see that alpha there, you got the phi, and then this is an eta, kind of looks maybe a little bit like an epsilon, but it's an eta, and then the start of the mu there, from hemeron ionos, from the days of the age or from the days of eternity, something to that effect. And again, I've translated this in that prior video more fully. All right, so that's the end of that verse. And then we have a nice dia tuta. You see that quite a bit, not only in the Septuagint, but like in Paul or something, for this reason or on account of this, something like that. Then we have the start of dose, that future of didymi. So you see that delta with the broken off bit of an omega. And then we don't have anything for the rest of that, but most scholars would argue that it's dose, altus, heos, kairu, tiktu. That's not done yet. So for this reason, he will give them, most likely referring back to God, until a time, and then tick 2 has got to finish on the next line. It's tick 2 seis. Notice that lunate sigma, eta sigma, until someone giving birth. That's from tikto, if you know that verb there. Tick 2 seis, so a feminine form. Someone's going to give birth. And then you have texitai, that's the future form of tikto. So you got a participle form and then the future form. So until she who is giving birth gives birth, if you will, that's the texitai. So until a time in which the one giving birth gives birth. And then we have the remnants of a chi there, so chi. And then most folks have to fill in the blank there with the hoi epiloipoi ton adelphon. So and the remainder or the remnant of the brothers. And then we see on the next line, it's his brothers. That is this ruler who has these going outs and so forth until his brothers. And then you can sort of make this out, even though it's a bit chopped up. You got an epsilon here, you got a p here, then a little remnant of a iota. You see a sigma, and it's a little bit bent, of course, because of the damage here. We got a rho there, t rho, and then you have basically the remnants of the psi, omicron, upsilon, sigma, iota, nu. So epistrepsusin. So in other words, the remnants or the leftovers of his brothers will return, and then epi, and then it's tu suius Israel, upon the sons of Israel there. You have to kind of fill that in as well. Just kind of pausing, stepping back. Let's just recap everything. So we have in you, house of Ephrathah, though it's something like, the least to be among the thousands of Judah, from you to me will come one to be. Let me erase some stuff here. As ruler in Israel, and his goings forth, there's the L2 there. Essentially, you have to supply the verb, are from the beginning, from eternal days, or from the days of the past or eternity, something like that. And for this reason, he will give them until a time she who is giving birth will give birth, and the remnant or rest of the brothers of him will return upon the sons of Israel. So you have this idea that you have this ruler who's going to come when he's born. That's a special time in which the ingathering of the scattered brothers will be brought back together with the sons of Israel, and all will be well. It's that kind of prophecy there. But again, I covered it more in that Micah video with Schreiner. Now we pick up with the next line. So you got a nice chi here and something. So it's chi stasitai. So we're missing a sigma tau here. Stasitai, you can make that out pretty clearly. Chi. And then you see a p here, omicron, mu, alpha, pretty straightforward, N. And so it's poimane, so he will shepherd. So in other words, stasitize, he will stand and he will shepherd. What we're missing mostly is in strength. And then you can make out this Paleo-Hebrew here. And I covered this in the last video. That's how this particular scroll represents the divine name. So I'll put that over here. So that's going to be the tetragrammaton. So in the name, in the strength of the Lord. So you can see the little vestigial remnant of that. So far, so good. Another chi here. Este from histemi. Eparse. That is the lifting up or the heights, sometimes even like pride, but not showing in a bad way. So, and he will be the high point or the pride or the exaltation. Then you have the start of anamatas here. So you see the omicron, N, O, mu, alpha, T. Omicron's kind of missing sigma there. So anamatas of the name. Then once again, you have a nice, clear Paleo-Hebrew version of the divine name. So he will be the lifting up of the name of the Lord. Then actually you have Theou out here. So Theou, notice it's not in the nomen sacrum form. It's spelled out fully, which further reiterates that this is a Jewish copy of the Greek of Micah. Now, most likely there's an altone out here, so I've supplied that. And let's finish out the line. You see on the left-hand side here, you got a guy and then epistraphesontai. So let's put that on the screen. And they will return. So you can see the epsilon is very small. There's a P that's kind of missing here. Yoda also fairly small. And then you see the strapheson. And then there's going to be an alpha somewhere in here and a Yoda. So that's the end of that verse. And lastly, we have a hati. Then we have noon. So nu, upsilon, nu. And then we have a nice mu there. Epsilon, gamma, alpha, lambda, and so forth. So it's mega lun the. So it's going to be a theta, etc. out here, most likely, because we see on the final line, sontai. So mega lun the sontai, hills there. You see the vestigial remnants of an omega. So the epsilon there, sigma there, until. So going back, so and they will return. And then for now, if you will, megalun thesatai, they will be magnified. This is the plural future passive, until, and then we have paratone. So you see the T there, or the tau, omega, nu, somewhere baked in here. And then you have a tes right there. And then lastly, gace. And that's technically into the verse. And then it's kai, estai, blah, blah, blah. So summarizing, for now, they will be magnified until the ends of the earth. All right, so that's Micah 5, 1 through 4. So if you're able to track along pretty well with that. So that's what we see in the Nechal Hever scroll. But let's take a look at how it shows up in, say, your Göttingen edition or the Old Greek that you might have in Rolf's Hanhart, which is really, really close to that. So I'm going to put these on the screen here. Obviously, this is a lot to go through. So what I'm going to do is just point out the key differences. So I'm not going to do a full translation of this because it's pretty close to the Nechal Hever one. Instead, what I'm going to do, and I've lined them up so that you can do the comparison more easily. I've even preserved some of the line breaks and so forth so that we can draw out key places where the Old Greek that you would find, say, on your own version of Rolf's Hanhart on your computer or a printed edition, what it's going to look like and how it compares to the Dead Sea edition. And then we'll draw together the conclusions from that. So you see that we start with the Kesu. That's fairly straightforward, but kind of right out of the gate. If you recall, on the Nechal Hever version, we have the Oikastu Ephrathah, house of Ephrathah, but most of the tradition is going to have Bethlehem. You might have wondered, wait, where's Bethlehem in the Nechal Hever version? Well, it is not present there. So that's pretty interesting. That's the first major difference. We have the Oikastu Ephrathah, though. That's fine. We have the Olegastos, but what you have on the Old Greek is a explicit verb here, so you are, and it could be that the scribe of this particular manuscript, because you have the start of Anai, and notice it was at the end of the line, maybe that accidentally dropped out. So it's in the Old Greek so far as the tradition holds, but it's missing here. And that could have been some sort of haplography due to the homoio arcton with the start of this A. Could be that they jumped forward, but you would expect them to miss the 2 in that case. So I'm not sure. It's just not there. So that's pretty interesting. Not a major deal. You just supply it. The next line is nice and straightforward. That's fine. They line up very easily. The next one also lines up just fine. So those are all the identical. Fair enough. Line 4 on the screen, instead of off, which we had from the days of the age or what have you, instead we have X. Of course, those mean, in this context, largely the same. They both work with the genitive, but that is a fairly subtle difference. And next two lines are actually fine. No big deal there. They're all nice and matching. But once you get to the remnant of the brothers, the Nechal Hever version had his brothers, whereas the traditional Old Greek that you'll typically find is going to have a plural form, their brothers, the remnant of their brothers. So that's interesting. Again, nothing major yet other than the Bethlehem. That's a pretty big deal. The others are, minor changes. The next line, though, is where things start to get quite interesting. So we have the kestesetai, that's fine. The Old Greek has opsetai, and that's what we have in the broader tradition of the Old Greek. So not only will he stand, but he will see. Then you do have the and he will shepherd, that's fine. But what you have on the Nechal Hever side is you go straight to in the strength of the Lord. Whereas on the Old Greek you have he will shepherd his flock. You have a specific object of this verb that you don't have in Nechal Hever. Then you have the in the strength of the Lord. So in other words, you're missing both the opsetai, that's not over here, and you're missing an explicit object of the shepherding. So that's starting to get a little bit more distinct. Then once you get to the very next line, already covered that, you have on the Nechal Hever version, we have and he stands as the highlight, the heights or something like that. Instead, on the Old Greek side, you have and in the glory of. And then actually the verb is going to show up on the next line. So instead of he will, he stands or will stand as the height of the name of the Lord, that's all fine. You got the name of the Lord, God. Although here we actually have the Lord God without an article, whereas the Old Greek does have the article there. So, not that big of a deal, but that happens. But this is a bigger difference. You got this glory versus this rising up. And you don't have a verb yet here, but you have the este. Then you have kai epistrephaesontai, and they will return, as opposed to they will be in the glory. So this right here, hyparxusin, is the verbal, the verbal sort of lead-in to this prepositional phrase. So they will be in the glory of the name of the Lord their God, as opposed to two separate verbs. The este referring back to the shepherd ruler, and then the epistrephaesontai referring to the remnant. So that's a pretty big difference. Then a couple little minor cleanup things. Towards the end, instead of hati that we saw, we have diati in the Old Greek. You have what we saw previously was the megalunthesontai, so a third plural, but instead now in the Old Greek we have megalunthesetai, so it's the third singular. So instead of the remnant being magnified here with the third singular, it's referring to the kingly ruler figure being magnified. And then lastly, peraton is sort of like the outermost limits. Instead, over here, we have the akron, which would be like the corner or the extremity. So similar idea, but different word choice there. So those are some of the key differences. You'll notice in terms of the sort of big picture, the first section of this, pretty good alignment. It's really not until the bottom section that you start to see some more substantial differences, with the exception of the Bethlehem, which is a pretty big deal. So what's interesting about that, when scholars sort of step back and look at this, is that some of these little differences are not that big of a deal. A scribe could just do that on occasion. But once you get to this kind of concentration of changes, then it's like, this doesn't appear to just be scribal noise, like accidental omission of a word and that kind of thing. There seems to be some sort of intentionality behind this. And so that's led to three primary theories to explain why the Minor Prophet Scroll from this particular cave deviates from the Old Greek. Now, I've only given you one example, but if you do it across the whole scroll, you arrive at these kinds of similar patterns and three basic explanations. One option is that this particular scroll reflects a full recension. A recension is a concentrated, deliberate effort at retranslation, maybe from the same basic Hebrew text, but they're like, let's just scrap it and let's start over. That's kind of one option, not a particularly popular option, but that is one that has been occasionally offered. Option two is that it's not really a retranslation per se. It's not like, hey, the one that we have is bad, let's do it again. Instead, it's like we have a totally different Hebrew source altogether. A local copy perhaps, and maybe that local Hebrew version like didn't have Bethlehem in it, and it had all those sort of differences with respect to the verbs and the shepherd and all that kind of stuff, and it's just different than what the quote-unquote Septuagint mainstream effort was working from. It's a faithful translation, it just happens to be a very different source text, and so some have offered that as a possible explanatory theory. But the most popular one at present, most likely, is option 3, which is essentially same Hebrew source, not a deliberate recension necessarily, where we're just going to throw out the old and do a new one, but it's more like a revision. But it's a Hebraizing one. That means maybe this group who produced this said, all right, the old Greek version, it exists and it's fine, but there's some places that we need to fix it and go back closer to what we have in what we would now call the Proto-Masoretic, which we don't have a lot of Hebrew copies for this section, but whatever it might have been, let's revise back to that. And it's not like a totally different Hebrew source. Instead, it's essentially the same Hebrew source that we see today, more or less, but a desire from a translation perspective to tighten that up a little bit, which would explain why there's still a lot of overwhelming continuity with what we have in the Old Greek. I mean, I showed you that in the prior screens, that a lot of it is spot on the same, which is why this option doesn't make sense, and this idea of a totally different Hebrew source doesn't make a lot of sense either. You wouldn't expect there to be this verbatim overlap. But instead, you have this continuity with the Old Greek, but selectively revising it back towards a Hebrew tradition. It'd almost be like, hey, in this section, y'all guys missed it. Let's fix it and go back to what we have in the Hebrew. We didn't like that little wording there or something like that, and so let's fix it. And the reason why that's interesting is that for a long time, folks thought that kind of effort that is often branded the Kaige effort, which I'll cover in a future video, or the so-called Proto-Theodotian effort, was a little bit later, but the fact that we find it in this particular scroll, as well as some of the others that we looked at, by the way, previously from the Dead Sea, suggests that kind of tendency, again, it's not necessarily a coordinated effort, but that kind of impulse goes back much earlier than maybe previously thought. So when this scroll was fully kind of digested and published, this became a pretty interesting finding. But I'll leave it up to you to kind of decide. I do tend to think that this is the best option, but you can't really prove it just from the Micah example. You got to introduce some of the other evidence, and that does appear to be the mainstream view with some subvariants, but that's good enough for today. Hopefully you've enjoyed this little introduction to some of the implications within the Septuagint world from this particular scroll from the Cave of Horrors. Hopefully you've enjoyed that. We'll come back to it down the road. I've rambled on enough for now. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. Thanks for tuning in.